Welcome to our summer anti-racism conversation series, PTS Responds. And I want to extend a very special hello and welcome to the neighborhood, even if it's virtual, to our new PTS students. You have quite an adventure ahead, and we can't wait to have your experience and curiosity and wisdom enrich PTS and help us all move closer to what we're aiming at, even with this series, beloved community. A welcome to our WMI guests who are tuning in. Just a reminder for those of you who are new, this is a Zoom webinar, which means that the primary means you'll have for interacting with us are the Q&A and chat pods. If you mouse over the bottom of your screen, you'll see both of the icons that refer to Q&A and to chat. Use chat to comment, to give an amen choir, to share resources with other people who are watching. Use the Q&A, which I'll be keeping an eye on, to ask questions of our guests today. Last week, we had a really lively conversation with Associate Professor of Homiletics and Worship, Angela Hancock. In an exchange that generated more comments and questions than perhaps any episode so far this summer, we talked about the challenge of proclaiming anti-racist witness in polarized communities, particularly church communities. Our focus was what we called the, quote, avoidant community, those churches where everyone seems to be in the same room, cordially wishing each other well and worshiping alongside their neighbor. But if you scratch just a little bit below that surface, you'll uncover vast and polemic political differences. And so for the sake of unity, the community and its leadership avoid addressing trigger topics out of fear of breaking the church because these differences feel incommensurable. So what are we to do, especially when bearing witness to the good news, the Word of God? And when doing that necessitates wading into waters that will inevitably ignite the flashpoints. How are we called to be faithful without being those problematic white church people King rightly criticizes in his letter from a Birmingham jail, whose gradualist approaches feel more like avoidance fueled by fear than genuine concern for justice? To that end, we talked about how the rhetoric used in dogmatic approaches to anti-racism sometimes ends up reinforcing division and prejudice, and how we make the mistake of treating this as a rational cognitive dilemma when so much is emotional, behavioral, and precognitive. We talked about beginning in these polarized communities with relationships of genuine trust and affection, and learning how to be multilingual, attuning to what the other can hear, and being mindful of the fear that operates when people feel like they don't or won't belong anymore. Perhaps it's no surprise that it should all begin with relationship. We are, after all, a faith predicated on the incarnation and belief in a Jewish teacher who managed to have both a tax collector and a zealot in the same intimate group. This week, we turn our attention to the ways that even the most well-intentioned faith communities can approach one of their most crucial areas of work, mission, in racist ways. We don't know what we don't know. And for this conversation, I am so pleased to bring my colleague and friend Hunter Farrell to the table. Hunter serves as our World Mission Initiative Director and brings 30 years of experience to his work here. With graduate and postgraduate work earned on 3 continents, he's been a professor in the DRC, he's been coordinator for the PCUSA's mission work in East and West Africa, he's been a community organizer addressing issues of poverty and justice in Peru, and he has been director for the World Mission of the PCUSA in Louisville. Since joining us, he's been instrumental in helping the seminary unpack its own commitments and practices to partnership and mission, helping us structure those engagements in ways that embody in both process and outcome the vision for the healing of the world embodied in Jesus's teaching and ministry. Welcome, Hunter. We're delighted to have you here.
Thanks, Helen. I've been looking forward to this. Appreciate the opportunity.
So you've had quite a peripatetic life, and you've a family and a work portfolio that point towards this vision. I typically begin these conversations by asking people what in their story informs the commitments they have now. So I'm going to ask you, how does a nice guy from Texas end up in Peru, the DRC, Louisville, and Pittsburgh? Oh, and Pasadena along the way too.
Right, right. Well, yeah, by the grace of God, I guess. I think I was, 23 when the church I grew up in Dallas, Texas, a large, I describe it as an evangelical Presbyterian church, a really focused mission. It gave 50% of its budget each year to foreign mission. So it's just a monster of commitment and a long obedience in the same direction, I think, in a beautiful way. I went as a 23-year-old. I had done my own rebellious time and in the teens, left church. And it was really the lure of working with the Congolese church that drew me back into the church. And so I signed up and went as a 23-year-old. Soon after arriving in the Congo, this is the Democratic Republic of Congo, the French is the national language. Chiluba is the regional language that you must learn to be able to communicate with the people that you're working with. So it was like this double language hurdle at the very beginning. But soon after I had gotten there, I was invited by the development committee of a parish in the city of Kananga, a city of about 250,000 people at that time. And they invited me to be part of their development effort. And I said, oh, great. Oh, I was so excited because I had studied development and I knew quite a bit. And so I was glad someone finally recognized that in me. When they told me that they wanted to create a soccer field, build a soccer field for their young people, my heart sank. I was like, I knew what infant malnutrition, what infant mortality was like in that area. In this particular area where they lived, the water contamination was massive. And so the quick fix, the easy thing to do to benefit everybody and be a blessing to everybody was to improve the water source. So in our first conversation, a direct speaker, I say what I think. We got into a big conversation and I think I interrupted more than I listened because I was convinced, we're really, building a soccer field is the last thing we should do. We really need to be working on the water issue. Now, I didn't have a whole lot of information about the village, but I knew the statistics for the region. The story developed, and I went the next week to the effort, and it was an all-day affair. The men felled 2 trees, the women cooked bija and goat meat. The kids, everybody picked up stones. They had a contest for how many stones and rocks you could move off the field. They had a beautiful soccer field with 2 posts at the end, at each end, and then a post at each end. At the end of the day, the home team won. There was this massive upsurge of pride. It's the first time they'd ever won a game because they didn't have a place to practice. And everybody came together in a way that just seemed to me magical. I felt like the Spirit was moving. And as I was getting ready to leave, an elder came to me, an elder of that church came to me and said, I wonder if you could come by next week. We'd like to talk to you about an issue we have with our water source. And I said, sure. Went home that night and I just sort of reviewed the actions, how a group of leaders knew intuitively what their community needed. And I, writing in the Great White Hope, had all kinds of assumptions about what they needed and the path they needed to take to get there. And I say that because that began a process. It just started opening up the layers, if you will, the layers of the onion to peel back and recognized how my life and my attitudes had been so deeply formed by the currents of racism that I grew up in. And I'd like to say it's particular to Texas or my era, but I see those same currents. We're just awash in those currents today. So I think that was the moment, Helen, that really drew me into this. And then I was blessed to be 23. And I was a learner of the language. So it put me in at an equal level with young men primarily who were my age, theological students at the seminary. And so I lived among Congolese students, learned Chiluba from them, and had a deep experience that I would describe as my conversion back into the Church of Jesus Christ because of their patient witness.
So I can imagine somebody listening to this and saying, wow, that's a beautiful story, but they really want to cut you a pass on your assumption that the water needed to be addressed. That's not racist. That's just being really concerned about the well-being and the health of these people for whom you care deeply and to whom you have been sent to help. How could that possibly be racist, Hunter?
And I would say, yeah, I think that's a good question, Helen. And I would say that our very way of conceptualizing our interaction, what is my role in that community? What are the strategies we will use to get to that place that they determine for themselves they want to go? And if they say that's going to be via a soccer field or another project, then there's a certain humility that needs to undergird my assumptions. And that was not there. I had spent some time, frankly, in prayer the night I left the community's our first conversation, and I said, can I in good conscience participate in this effort that is clearly wrongheaded? And so I just want to name that spirit of hubris, that spirit of ethnocentricity, that in a sense it's a kind of anthropological evolution that I'm assuming that they need to get on the path that I've been on, and maybe if they work hard, they'll catch up with me. So I name that as there's all kinds of areas where the way that I had been formed and the racist assumptions that I made then and continue to make, have to check myself today, were really at play in those relationships.
So one of the things that I appreciate so much about your story is that it shows the deeply human dilemma that is at the heart of becoming anti-racist. And that is the fact that some of the things that we participate in, which really do emerge out of a deep love for the other or a deep conviction about what we think is right and good for people, actually can sometimes operate out of racist assumptions. It was not racist. So what I'm hearing you say is that it was not racist to want clean water and improvement of health for these folks. It had to do with the process and your presumption that you knew the best way to get there. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah,
and I think we see that in the mission strategies that many of our congregations, whether Catholic or evangelical or mainline Protestant, use today. Mm-hmm. And I think that's highly problematic, and we need to stop and think about that together.
So the phrase that you have used in talking about what needs to happen to mission is the phrase decolonizing, which may be a new phrase to some of the folks who are listening in. Could you explain a little bit what you mean by that?
Sure. I think because, 550 years ago, when European missionaries first began reaching out to Africa, Asia, the New World, as it was called, North and South America, it was being birthed, this whole notion of carrying the gospel to other lands in the ways that Europeans did it was being birthed at the same time that the colonial movement was. And so missionaries boarded slave ships to get to where they needed to go. They boarded colonial vessels. They traveled with colonial agents. The classic image in Congo, Congolese Presbyterians would talk about the early missionaries sitting on the porch and having tea with the governor, with the colonial governor. So that hand-in-glove relationship between colonial political power and subjugation and the colonial effort, and the good news of Jesus Christ, the suffering servant, the one who girds his loins and kneels at the feet of the friend. It's highly problematic. And I don't know, because of the power of the missionary halo, our respect, our awe for people, quite frankly, like me, who have spent some time in service, whether local or global in missionary service, there's a sense that we get this royal pass, if you will, and that our assumptions don't need to be questioned. And I appreciate your very discerning way of seeing there is a difference. We may have the best of intentions, but we're also responsible for outcomes. Teju Cole says we need to look constellationally. We need to think and line up the dots so that we can see clearly, where is this going? Whose agenda is this?
So one of the jobs congregations have then, faith communities have, is to begin to go back to the way they structure and think about their approach to mission. One of the things that you and I have talked about quite a bit is how these days, particularly church-based mission programs, are basically inefficient. And you're pretty frank about problematizing common approaches to mission. And in doing so, you're kind of tipping over a sacred cow here in Western PA, where the idea of being missional is so deeply part of the DNA of so many Protestant, particularly Presbyterian churches. So let's see if we can spend a little bit of time talking about the questions that churches need to ask and what you mean when you're talking about church-based mission programs being inefficient, that there are glaring contradictions baked into the program itself.
Yeah, thanks. Well, perhaps it's best to start with an example. The biggest change in the last 50 years in the way that U.S. Christians engage in mission is that they've moved from working in an indirect way through mission agencies, through their denomination, through independent mission boards, to a congregational approach. So congregations and even individuals, actually the pendulum continues to move as we move towards an increasingly individualistic culture. The pendulum continues to move in that direction. And so we see a lot of folks engage primarily through their congregation or individually. Maybe they'll sponsor a child. Maybe they'll send financial support to an orphanage in Haiti. Maybe they'll participate themselves in a short-term mission trip. To start with short-term mission trip, which was not even a blip on the radar 60 years ago, and now is the single largest expenditure for the mission committee, the mission budget of congregations across the spectrum in the U.S., Catholic, evangelical, and mainline Protestant.
One of the numbers you quote here, which I'm just going to plug, I think it's astonishing, is that it is a more than $4 billion a year industry, short-term mission trips.
U.S. Christians alone, not to mention others. We have doctors and teachers and all kinds of folks doing things.
That's just U.S. Christian churches.
U.S. Christian churches, yeah. So the challenge is short-term mission, it can be one of the most powerful blessings, and it opens up a window. I think it's one of the ways that God has offered us to begin to see for the first time and address the racist tendencies that we have in our society that are baked into the way that I was raised, and I think everyone in this broadcast was raised. At the same time, it's a mission strategy that's made in our own image. It fits all of our needs. It fits perfectly into my vacation. Isn't that amazing?
It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you look at, I think the most honest statement spoken after a short-term mission trip is the person who comes back from a trip to Haiti or the DR or India and says, you know, we got so much more out of it than we gave. And amen, that's so true. It is so true because we did, darn it. And I don't think even our grandparents' generation would look at how we engage in mission today and say, that's the mission of Jesus Christ. I think if we're honest with ourselves, and that's what I so appreciate, the reason I can hang with the hopefulness within the Christian denominations and the Catholic Church today, is that I see so many people, you're right, there is a lot of pushback when you begin to just make the slightest critical statement about that sacred cow among us, which is
because people have had life-changing experiences on these trips. It has shaped their approach. It's opened up a wellspring of compassion for those who are, quote, less fortunate, unquote. It in an important way, it taps into that desire to be connected to the other and the compassion. But as you're pointing out, it's highly problematic. One of the things you've also said is how church activities and budgets are deeply racist in this approach. And so I'm going to ask you to wade into those waters, knowing that you're probably hitting pretty close to home for some of the folks on our broadcast today. What do you mean by that? Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, just as, in the opening story, just as I engaged as a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed 23-year-old with all the cultural assumptions, which were profoundly racist, in their orientation. As I stepped into that encounter with the best of intentions, into that Congolese community outside of Kananga in the Congo, as I did that, I think we do the same thing in mission committees and sessions and church councils across the country. The challenge to me is that when you look at funding today, it is so donor-centric, it's enough to make you cry. Who's the one who knows the needs best? It's the person closer to the need. We know that as a general principle. And yet at the same time, we reserve the right to assess someone's needs in a different culture, 7,000 miles away from us, so that they can meet our criteria. I think that's highly problematic, and I think it points to, beyond the ethnocentrism, I think there's a racist current here, a current of that systemic racism, where the white European knows what's best for the colonial subject. And so we know, and even to call the whole process of colonization, there's still a debate today among folks at the popular level where they'll say, but colonialism was actually good for those folks. We built roads, we dug mines, we put
improved health, brought civilization.
Yeah, and all those things are beautiful blessings that missionaries and colonial agents did. Praise God. I think that's wonderful. At the same time, because the process rarely included local voices, we participated in what I believe is a diabolical process that was beyond tinged, it was tainted with racism.
One of the things we'll be talking about is this book that you're writing, Three Stones Make Home. And in the introduction, you use the phrase, the selfie mission, to show how the current approach to mission, which seems to be capitalizing on some of the worst tendencies of the origins of mission in terms of its self-interest, has now grown side by side with the increase of narcissistic and self-interested tendencies in people. So you talk about the, quote, selfie mission. So if I could just be given the boon of a short paragraph that you write, you say, increasingly, it seems the strategies used most frequently by local congregations in their global mission efforts are shaped to fit the needs of U.S. mission supporters rather than the needs or hopes of the communities around the world. Somehow the symbol of our age in mission has become a, quote, selfie, a self-portrait instantly shareable and likable with all our friends on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and other social media that help us frame ourselves in a benevolent posture, helping the poor and destitute around the world.
Yeah, and that is me. I mean, I see so much of that still. I team taught a course with Kimberly Gonche beginning 2 years ago. We do this every 6 months at Pittsburgh Seminary. And because we are different in gender, race, and age, we come to this team approach with significant differences in understanding the content of what we're going to teach. And we teach a course called Intercultural Experiential Learning. We partner some academic work with an intercultural mission trip, an experience where people go to a different place, either in the United States or abroad. And I think this has been helpful for me to get a sense of that, how in US culture, building on that colonial base, which we haven't in 500 years, in the 200 years that we see that particularly strong in the US context, we haven't engaged in a serious critique at the local level, at the popular level. I guess what I'm hungry for is, you may have I think you have a picture that I sent you. I don't know if you can pop that up. I need to own the fact that I'm a part of this culture too, and that I have participated in these, not only racist approaches to mission with those racist assumptions, but also with the selfie piece. One of the young adult volunteers that we worked with in Peru took a picture of this. This is in the town of La Oroya, a town where about 8,000 children had lead poisoning due to the toxic emissions of a US-owned metal smelter. And so Jason, the young adult volunteer, took this picture, sent it to me. And I mean, my heart just was just warmed and was so proud of seeing this. At the same time, I realized that so many of our photos, and that started me on a trek, path of research. I looked at more than 1,000 images on church mission web pages. How do we represent the mission of God and our participation in it? And 95% of the pictures were something like this. It showed someone like me, and I'm good intentioned. I'm a great guy. I'm not criticizing myself, but there I am in the center of things. In the center of the frame is the great white hope. And my concern is, I think in our own concern with how we represent ourselves in the world, we're upstaging God. We're not doing what the Apostle Paul calls us to do, who never flinched when he recognized his own limitation as the messenger and not the message. So I think my sense of this is that we need to be really careful in the ways that we represent mission. One of the things we call for in the book, my colleague, Balajid Lam-Klep, who's the Associate Director of the World Mission Initiative, developed for this book, the book that we're doing, Three Stones Make Home, Transforming Congregational Mission. He did a toolkit of 8 tools, and one of those tools is an inventory that congregations can use to see how do they represent mission, how do they represent the culturally other, the racially other, who's at the center of the photo, and whose work is being glorified. So I think these tools can be really helpful for a congregational mission leader to turn around and lead their congregation in a helpful way that can be a blessing to partners.
Before I stop sharing the screen, one of the things that also strikes me about this photo is that you're doing something that so many well-intentioned Great White Hopes say that they want to do, which is to give voice to the voiceless. You're doing it literally. That's a microphone, right, that you're holding?
Yeah, a megaphone, yeah.
And this, or a megaphone, this idea that we come to give voice is such a problematic way of thinking about our intervention in these places. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the screen now. This is a great opportunity to lead into your discussion about the book that you and Bala are authoring, Three Stones Make Home. I'd like you to explain the title, what the title means, and talk a little bit about how you're hoping this book will begin to help communities address some of these structural issues that you've been identifying that are at the heart of congregational approaches to mission.
Yeah, well, thanks, Helena. This, as you know, has been my passion for these years. It's been a long time birthing this book. But my excitement for Three Stones Makes Home, it takes its kind of that central image, that metaphor, if you will, from the cooking fire, the 3-stone cooking fire that in your mind's eye, perhaps you can see common in homes across the global South. What I argue in the book is that the way that we're engaged, that we understand and engage in mission today as U.S. congregations is highly problematic, and that we need something akin to a reformation. We need to reset the stones, the foundational stones that we build our understanding and practice of mission on. And so to do that, I posit 3 areas where we can, in fact, do something, beginning next week as we gather in the mission committee meeting, or as we gather in a Sunday school class and do that education piece, which is foundational to all of this. I posit 3 stones, if you will. The first is a theology of companionship. It changes the dynamic. Oftentimes we enter into mission to accomplish a project. Mission becomes a checklist rather than, as you wisely noted at the start, it's a relationship in Christ through the incarnation, through the 30 years that Jesus invests of his life. He doesn't preach a sermon in 30 years. He pours his life into learning about the local language, the local religion, the local culture, and becomes fluent in it. That commitment to journey with the people of Palestine in that first century gives me great hope and provides a beautiful missionary model for us. Even as the Presbyterian Church has worked a lot with the theology of partnership, But that oftentimes, at least in translation, and I think also in English, it's understood partnership is what business people do. You do your part, I do mine. If you don't fulfill your contract, then the contract's off and we're no longer partners.
It's transactional the way you've just described it.
Highly transactional, and it lends into the commodification of mission,
Yes.
where we make mission a thing that we can buy and sell.
And the provision of services and resources and even the good news to the other.
And I think that's problematic to the point of diabolical. I think we gut the gospel when we engage in mission in a transactional way. So I posit more than a relational way. I use the example actually of a recent graduate from Pittsburgh Seminary, a Ghanaian American immigrant, Ben T, whom you know, I think, Helen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Who is now pastoring, he's pastoring 2 yoked congregations in Iowa. And as I visited him, as I participated in his ordination service a couple years ago, he embodies so much of this model of companionship as a primary way to look at the way that we engage in God's mission. And so I lift him up as an example and look at the elements that we can tease out of how to live in a theology of companionship rather than a checklist or even a partnership relationship.
So stone 1 is companionship.
Yeah, thanks. The second stone is cultural humility. I think one of the challenges is we Americans give ourselves one of the biggest passes on earth because we say, oh, I'm an American, I don't learn language. And so we don't learn languages, we don't learn cultures, we expect people to do it our way because ours, frankly, is the best way, right? And again, that colonialistic understanding of our assumptions. So I propose an approach to cultural humility that I think is going to be really important. And the third stone, just to close this, is a concept that I call co-development, which rather than imagining, I think so many of us get into our deepest relationships with a spouse, a partner, and we have this unexpressed assumption that we're going to develop them. Somehow we're going to change them for the better. We may not articulate it, we may not even be aware of it. And if you've ever done, I've done some marriage counseling, and you recognize how painful that is when a spouse has to say to the other, you know, I'm not the object of your development project. I think we have to have the same sensitivity, not only with our children, but also with our mission companions, the people that we work with. And so I argue in the book for developing a style that is much more mutual. It's radically mutual, and where we invite the other to help us in our development. Because Lord knows, I think in this moment of COVID reflection and this wave of violence around racism in the United States, I think we're particularly sensitive to the fact that we need to rethink some things in our own society.
We've got 2 great questions that have come in, and in part I want to say to both of our questioners, get the book when it comes out on IVP Press late in 2021. So I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait. The first question is, if I suspect a group has slipped into this colonial thinking, how do I gently suggest maybe that this is a topic we should dig into? What would you say?
I would say, Helen Blyer, you open the door to the most powerful way we can do that, and that is by telling a story about ourselves. Because I think, and I say this from the bottom of my heart, if we can't own the colonial tendencies that we see in ourselves, then we have no business pointing out the speck in our neighbor's eyes. So I think it's really important. I think you opened up these difficult conversations about race. I think every conversation about race needs to begin with a story about self, so that we can own the limitedness of our own perspective and how we need the other, and we need to be blessed by the other's perspective. So I think that's an extremely helpful way. We also put in the book, particularly in the toolkit that Bala has prepared, some concrete strategies for helping people to look at the images that they present, how do you talk about mission in your congregation? When you come back from the mission trip, who's the subject of the action that you're describing? And so I think that those kinds of strategies and tools can be helpful for a congregation.
Another person asks, in what way do we recognize privilege and utilize that in an anti-racist way? Or is it more about recognizing privilege and giving up power?
That's great. I'm the consummate practical person. And so I'm always looking for, given this power, God gave us this power, our society through crooked ways, we have gotten it, and we have it today. How do we use that for the blessing of the world? Because that's always been part of the Christian church's understanding. You take what you have, you bring to the table what you have. And I think that's a wholesome, we'll develop that in that 3 stones make home, that invites us to the Paschal feast, where Jesus Christ himself offers himself. And so I think we are called to bring what we have to the table, whether that's financial resources, our social capital, our Rolodex, our political savvy and capacity. How to use that then? We have a series of stories in the book that show how specific congregations have used, particularly the social capital, the social capital that they've been blessed with, because I think that's critically important. In summary, though, I think the key issue when we give to a child sponsorship program, when we give to so many of the mission strategies that U.S. congregations are investing in now, I think we need to be aware that we're excluding the people who can do the most good. We give to a foreign agency that goes in and takes care of kids for an afternoon program. Why don't we look at ways we can strengthen mom and dad and their ability to do what God intended them to do for their child in that particular place? So it's about 3/4 of the orphans today, according to research done. I've got a colleague in the American Society of Missiology, Kim Lamberty, who's done some remarkable work. And she shows that 3/4 of the orphans in the world are paper orphans. That is, they're not in fact orphans. They have a mom or a dad, or maybe both, but it has behooved the family to give that child up to an orphanage, to institutional care, because it pays. It'll allow not only that local organization to get funds from foreigners like us, oftentimes Christians, but also it allows their child to get better health care and food and education sometimes. What if we
highly problematic? And then, of course, we're very well aware of the abuses that can happen in these institutional settings too. Not to say that nuclear families are free of any kind of abuse, but there's something very violent and disruptive in what you've just described that happens to the child and the family, and the ability of the village itself, the community, to identify and deal with its own problems.
I think subsidiarity is an approach, is a principle in Catholic social doctrine that I think is really important. That is, let's go to the local level, get as close to the challenge as possible to be able to feed the folks, give tools to the folks, remove barriers from the folks who are best equipped to solve the challenge. And so I think that's a great approach. And so we'll show some examples of that in the book.
So I've got a couple of questions here, along with a request for us to do something celebratory when the book comes out, so that we can let folks know about it. Mission committees may have goals of encouraging members to meet others face-to-face, making the most impact on quality of life, spiritual growth, encouraging members' mission giving. Can you walk us through some of these as to which can be tweaked, which should be discarded? Or am I asking the wrong question? Is it wrong for a mission committee to establish some basis for evaluating our partnerships?
No, in fact, I think one of the glaring shames of the way that we engage in mission, I can speak from the Presbyterian Church USA's perspective. I did a survey I had 1,400 congregational mission leaders across the PCUSA at the national level. And more than 60% of those congregations did nothing, in fact, to evaluate their work. So there's thousands, in the case of a small church, thousands of dollars, and in a large church, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars into a situation where they're in fact not evaluating. They've never asked their partner, how's this working for you? And so I do think I think that's highly problematic. So I would strongly encourage folks to engage in evaluation. One of the pieces that Bala and I have looked at together is providing tools for the cross-cultural evaluation of the work. As you know, there's certain cultural dynamics. Part of it is the legacy of colonialism. Part of it is the individualistic, the direct communication approach of our cultural background, particularly white dominant culture in the US. And that it tends to lead us into a one-way street where we're the only voice talking. And so we ask the questions, we give the answers. And so I think that's particularly important. The book will help with that. I would encourage folks beyond evaluating their work to, as they shift into a long-term relationship, as opposed to a short-term relationship. We're all on best behavior when company comes. But if we can develop a rhythm of life, which includes joint worship, joint Bible study, gathering together, sharing concerns, praying together. You're having trouble getting a prayer meeting going in your church, work with your global partners. They would love to pray with you. It can be a remarkable and powerful time. I think that opens up the door for us to begin to lessen that power distance in the relationship, so that people can actually share their feedback in some of their critique and their support for the ways that we're engaged in mission, maybe even in their community.
So much of what you're describing right now in terms of this partnership dynamic and the stance of humility seems to relate to the work of being a good cross-racial white ally, given the issues of racial injustice in this country. This isn't just an international phenomenon. This is something that we need to be doing in terms of listening, partnering with, not assuming that we have all of the answers or that our only perspective is either the dominant or the best perspective. So as you're talking, I'm thinking about how it would change race relations to focus on that kind of allyship, the idea of building relationships, of doing conversation, of asking the other what their story and their perspective is, and how that would change racial dynamics in the country.
And I think, Helen, I think this is I think God's sense of humor and God's compassionate love for all of us and God's remarkable, long-suffering patience with us. I think God has opened up a door of mission for if you think about it, every member of our congregation approaches mission as an experience of the other with their guard down. Most of us engage, it's the one place where we can engage with someone who is racially or culturally other and have our guard down, because we say, well, we may be different, but we have Jesus Christ in common. And I think that is, one of God's remarkable gifts to humanity. That's one of them, because mission then becomes an open door for a local congregation to begin to deal with its own racism that it maybe has never named, maybe doesn't even see, because as you said earlier, we don't know what we don't know. They've never thought in these ways, but in careful interaction with their mission companions, they can go deep in recognizing and beginning to address the racism in their own circles. I think that's a gift to us.
And it seems to me embedded in your responses, given the previous question we had about do we just need to check our privilege at the door, to pretend that we don't have it or that it doesn't exist is disingenuous and doesn't bring us fully honest to the table of the partnership. The question is how that privilege is used and how it's leveraged in the context of that relationship. One of our other folks, and this is going to be our last question before we round the corner to home and talk about a great way interested folks can engage in some of this anti-racist and decolonizing work through our conference. Our guest asks, how do we engage in dialogue with people who feel they have to do something on a mission trip? The people who value serving over learning and companionship, because we're an action-oriented culture. You've described yourself as a pragmatist. Doesn't it make sense that we'd want to go someplace and do something concrete that helps people? How do we engage in that dialogue?
Yeah, and bless us. That's where we come from culturally. That's who we are. And rather than checking that at the door, I take a page out of Kim Lamberty's thinking also in this. She has engaged her folks in doing a community study. She paired a group of local university students who had some ties to the local campus ministry. She paired them with a short-term mission trip group, a mission team from her church. This is in Lafayette, Indiana, and sent them to Haiti. Well, the task that they had was to learn all that they could with a partner about the community in which that partner was located. And so what that did was it disrupted the traditional almost trope of a colonialistic approach where the great white saviors coming in to save the local folks, often people of color. In the Haiti case, it was accurate. Breaking that up, they came alongside each other. So this is it's a local, it was a Catholic parish in Haiti with a Catholic parish in Lafayette, Indiana. They came together and they committed themselves to learning as much as they could about the community. So they engaged in there was a questionnaire involved. They went to houses. The North Americans had to rely on the Haitians to be able to do the language work, the cultural translation. I think it's time for us to leave. I think we've outstayed our welcome. Or they want us to have tea. No, they want to serve us a meal and engage them in deeper relationships. So I do think we have a remarkable opportunity to channel that desire to do good, that desire to do something, to make a difference in the world. I think those are valid and good intentions. But I think if we can channel them effectively, and I think that's the responsibility of every mission leader and whatever congregation or parish you're in the United States, I think that's a primary responsibility. That's why I think the book's important, and I think this conversation is vitally important.
This is a great segue to something that you and I have been, and Bala and others from WMI have been working on now for several months. I'm going to share screens so that we can see the promotional postcard for our upcoming. We've taken the McClure Lecture and the WMI Conference and combined them. And of course, in an age of COVID, we are no longer able to get together face-to-face in the same space. But I think we've turned it into something even better. It's a month of mission series with our featured plenary speakers who will help us unpack the embedded racism in our approaches to mission. So we've got Brenda Salter McNeil, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, both of whom have long track records of engaging in this conversation, and David Camp, who's going to be helping us with a workshop. These will be on successive Wednesday nights through the month of October. Hunter, say a little bit about what was behind the big hope for putting this series together.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. 14 months ago, the Spirit moved in our committee. It's students and local pastors who together helped plan this biennial conference and the annual McClure Lectures. When we made a commitment at that time to look at the relationship of race and mission. Because we identified race as a primary impediment to engaging in God's mission faithfully and effectively across the world, whether it's locally in our local cities or towns or across the world. Mm-hmm. And so we made that commitment in terms of the theme. We selected our speakers. As COVID descended on us in February and March of this year, again, in a sense, God's gift to us, we're trying to channel in helpful ways this steward well, the resource that we have. So we flipped the conference. And I think we hit on something, the Spirit's movement across America this summer around issues of racial justice and yes. the cost of systemic racism, daily systemic racism in the lives of African Americans and other people of color in this country. It has just sort of opened people's eyes, and many pastors and congregational mission leaders are seeking tools. So we decided to flip the conference. We moved it to a 4 Wednesday night series. So
Bible study.
Many congregations have a Wednesday night gathering or study or small group work. And so taking advantage of that, we'll have 4 Wednesdays in October where we'll invite congregations to tune in to hear Brenda Salter McNeil, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, or David Camp, or a discussion among them as the meat of the presentation. And then we'll break for what we're calling congregational virtual watch parties. Each congregation is organizing themselves. I talked with John Magnuson, who is with us on this broadcast. Myers Park Presbyterian Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, one of the largest PCUSA congregations. Several of their pastors are organizing a watch party with a particular group, the deacons or the session, the mission committee, or the college group. So I think there's some power in doing, in a sense, taking a page out of Don McClure and Lyda McClure's effort. It was so important to them to engage in congregation at the congregational level. And so I think we're trying to do that in this Flipped Mission series.
Give us one or two things you want people to leave this conversation with. And before you step into those waters, I want to tell folks that our chat, which has been very, very active during this conversation, please look at it. There are a number of resources linked, as well as the WMI conference registration page if you want more information. So Hunter, bring us home. What do you want folks to leave our conversation with?
I think for us to begin to imagine a theology of companionship, that is a walking together with, journeying with a companion from the Latin and the early French. It's the one with whom we eat bread. And there's something really powerful and downright liturgical and Eucharistic about it, that you let down your guard. You are who you are with these companions in mission. And I think that's the model for us. So the road to Emmaus, those images, those multicultural images we've all seen of the road to Emmaus, I think that is an image for us, an icon, if you will, that we need to reflect in front of for a while. I would say, particularly around the issue of the cultural humility, I think if we can somehow imagine an attitude of humility and sort of disciplining ourselves to allow our mission companions to have both the first word, a formulation of where we need to go, and the last word. What would happen if we allowed them those two words? Because generally, I found for myself that it's my word that's the first and often the last word. And with my funding decision or allocation of resources, that decision, I'm having the last word in that relationship. And I think that's a major challenge for us. So I would hold those two ideas up, and I really am grateful for the chance to think about these things with you today.
Hunter, thank you so much for being with us. This has been fantastic. Given the chatter we see in the chat pod here, it has really moved a lot of the folks who are on this conversation. A reminder to those of you who are listening in, we record these conversations and the recording will be available about 10 minutes after we sign off. It will be parked permanently along with all of our other recorded sessions on the PTS Race and Faith resource, which can be requested through the PTS website. Next week, we conclude our series with our 11th and final conversation with President David Esterline. Use the same link you used today to log in if you'd like to participate in that. And if you've got feedback for us on this whole series, the topics, the content, the format, please let us know. Email us at coned@pts.edu, or you can email me personally at hblyer@pts.edu. Our hope has been to spark some good thinking and conversation around a super hard topic to discuss. And I think over the course of our 2.5 months together, we have seen how the issue of systemic racism addresses nearly, if not nearly every single sector of our lives as people of faith and people in community. It's a big thing to have to deal with. It seems impossible to solve. I think that we have shown over the course of the summer that with good company and in good conversation, we take each step that we need to take in order to address the issue. Hunter, again, thanks so much for being with us, and we look forward to all of our listeners joining us next week and, of course, in October at the WMI conference. Take care, everybody.